The sound of the slap echoed through the ballroom like a crack of thunder, and for one long moment, nobody breathed. Eliza Whitmore stood with her hands still raised, her chest rising and falling in fast, sharp breaths. Before her, the Duke of Ashcombe pressed his fingers to his reddened cheek, his eyes wide with shock. Around them, hundreds of candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, throwing golden light over silk gowns and powdered faces that had all turned, as one, to stare. Then the laughter began. It started as a gasp, a ripple of disbelief passing through the crowd, and then it broke into open laughter, cruel and delighted, the kind of laughter that feeds on another person's ruin. Fans snapped open to hide smiling mouths. Men leaned toward each other, whispering behind gloved hands. Somewhere near the orchestra, a woman laughed so hard she had to steady herself against a pillar. Eliza did not look away from the Duke. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Only minutes earlier, she had been standing quietly near the edge of the dance floor, trying to make herself as small and unnoticed as possible in her plain gray gown, a gown she had mended twice at the hem so that no one would see the frayed edges. Her family had once held land and title enough to rival half the room, but 3 years of failed harvests and her father's foolish investments had stripped them of nearly everything except their name, and even that was beginning to feel borrowed. The Duke of Ashcombe had approached her with a glass of wine in his hand, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Whitmore," he had said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "how brave of you to attend, dressed as though you borrowed that gown from your own housemaid." A few people nearby had chuckled. Eliza had felt her face grow hot, but she had said nothing, hoping he would grow bored and move on to torment someone else. He had not moved on. "Tell me," he continued, swirling the wine in his glass, "does your father still believe he will recover his fortune, or has even he given up that particular delusion? I hear the moneylenders have grown quite tired of his promises." The laughter around them had grown louder. Eliza had felt something inside her chest twist and tighten, a pressure building behind her ribs that she could not name. She thought of her mother, sitting at home with her hands folded in her lap, praying that Eliza might catch the eye of some kind gentleman who could save them. She thought of her younger sister, Charlotte, who deserved a chance at a real life, a real match, a real future. "You may laugh at me, Your Grace," Eliza had said quietly, "but you will not laugh at my family." "Oh?" The Duke had raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying himself. "And what will you do about it, Miss Whitmore? Weep? Faint? Run home to your mother?" "No," Eliza had said. "I believe I will do this instead." And then her hand had moved before her mind had fully decided to move it, and the sound of the slap had rung out across the ballroom, and now here they stood, the whole of London society watching, laughing, waiting to see what would happen next. The Duke lowered his hand from his cheek. His expression had shifted from shock into something colder, something more dangerous. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrow, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only Eliza and those closest to them could hear it. "You have made a grave mistake tonight, Miss Whitmore." "Perhaps," Eliza said, refusing to let her voice shake, "but it was the only honest thing anyone has done in this room all evening." A murmur passed through the crowd. Somewhere behind her, Eliza heard her mother's voice, sharp with panic, calling her name. She felt a hand close around her wrist, firm and urgent, and she was pulled backward through the crowd of staring faces, past the tables of untouched cakes and the string quartet that had stopped playing entirely, out through the tall glass doors and into the cold night air. "Have you lost your mind?" Margaret Whitmore hissed, once they were far enough from the ballroom that no one could hear. Her mother's face was pale, her hands trembling as she gripped Eliza's arm. "Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand who that man is?" "I understand exactly who he is," Eliza said. "A man who thinks that because he was born with a title, he may say whatever cruel thing he pleases to whoever he pleases, and no one will ever hold him to account." "And now the whole of London will hold you to account instead," her mother said, her voice breaking. "Eliza, we cannot afford this. We cannot afford scandal. Your sister's engagement, our standing, everything we have left. It all depends on people believing we are still respectable." Eliza looked back toward the glowing windows of the ballroom, where the party continued without them, the music starting up again, the laughter fading into ordinary conversation as though nothing at all had happened. "I know what it depends on, Mother," she said quietly, "but I could not let him speak of Father that way. I could not stand there and smile while he tore us apart for sport." Her mother said nothing for a long moment. Then she took Eliza's face gently in both hands, the anger in her eyes softening into something closer to grief. "You are so much like your grandfather," she whispered. Too proud to bow, even when bowing would save you. They rode home in silence, the carriage wheels rattling over the cobblestones, the city lights blurring past the window. Eliza pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes, replaying the moment again and again. She did not regret the slap. She regretted only that it would not be enough, that words like his would keep being spoken, that men like him would keep believing themselves untouchable. By the time they reached their modest townhouse, word had already begun to spread. A letter had arrived, delivered by a servant on horseback, sealed with wax and addressed to her father, Eliza's father, a thin man with tired eyes and hands that shook slightly when he was troubled, read it by candlelight in the drawing room, while Eliza and her mother stood waiting. "It is from the Ashcombe estate," he said finally, his voice flat. "The Duke demands a formal apology, delivered in writing, and read aloud before witnesses at the next assembly. He wants to humiliate her twice," her mother said, sinking into a chair. Eliza said nothing. She stood by the window, watching the dark street outside, where a single carriage passed slowly, its lanterns glowing like small trapped stars. "I will not apologize," she said. Her father looked up sharply. "Eliza, I struck him because he insulted this family in front of 200 people," she said, turning to face him. "If I apologize, I admit that what he said was fair. I admit that we deserve to be laughed at. I will not do that, Father, not even to save us." Her father was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the letter in his trembling hands. Then, to her surprise, something like the ghost of a smile crossed his tired face. "Your grandfather once told a general to his face that his battle plan was foolish," he said softly. The general was furious. 3 days later he changed the plan, and it saved half his men. Pride is not always a fault, Eliza. Sometimes it is the only thing standing between us and silence. Charlotte appeared in the doorway then, still in her nightgown, her eyes wide with worry. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did you truly slap the Duke of Ashcombe?" "I did," Eliza said. Charlotte's mouth fell open, and for a moment, Eliza feared her sister would cry. Instead, slowly, a small and disbelieving laugh escaped her. "Everyone will be talking about it for weeks," Charlotte whispered. "Yes," their mother said grimly, rising from her chair. "That is precisely the problem." That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Eliza sat by her window, still dressed in her mended gray gown, staring out at the dark garden below. She thought of the Duke's cold eyes as he lowered his hand from his cheek, the fury barely contained beneath his composed expression. She thought of the way the entire room had laughed at her, delighted by her disgrace, and how none of them, not one, had laughed when he insulted her father. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know how deep the scandal would cut, or how many doors would close because of what she had done. But sitting there in the darkness, with her family's whispered arguments still echoing faintly through the walls, Eliza felt something steady settle inside her chest, something that felt almost like peace. She had not bowed. Whatever came next, she had not bowed. Somewhere across the city, in a grand house with high ceilings and cold marble floors, the Duke of Ashcombe stood alone in his study, a glass of brandy untouched on the table beside him. He touched his cheek again, where the sting had long since faded, though something else lingered in its place, something he could not quite name. He had been mocked before, in subtle ways, by rivals and gossips who thought themselves clever. He had never once been struck. He had never once looked into the eyes of someone who showed no fear of him at all. He sat down slowly, staring into the dying fire, and found that he could not stop thinking of the way she had said it, quiet and unshaken. It was the only honest thing anyone has done in this room all evening. He did not yet know what he intended to do about Eliza Whitmore, but he knew, with a strange and unfamiliar certainty, that this would not be the end of it. A knock came at the study door, and his valet entered, bowing low. "Your Grace, forgive the late hour. A letter has arrived from Lord Colt. He asks whether you intend to press the matter of tonight's insult formally, before the courts of society." The Duke did not answer at once. Baron Edmund Colt had never liked him, not truly, though he wore friendliness like a well-tailored coat. There was something in the way Colt always seemed to know exactly which wound to press, exactly which rumor to plant, that made the Duke wary of owing him anything, even the appearance of an alliance.
"Or tell Lord Colt I will consider it,"
the Duke said finally, "and send no reply tonight." The valet bowed again and withdrew, leaving the Duke alone once more with the fire and his thoughts. He rose and walked to the tall window overlooking the dark street, where a light rain had begun to fall, silver under the glow of the street lamps. He thought of his father, long since passed, A stern man who had taught him that weakness was a door through which enemies would always find their way in. He thought of the years he had spent building a reputation that no one dared challenge, a name that commanded silence wherever he entered a room. And yet tonight, in front of the very people who feared him most, a woman in a mended gray gown had looked him in the eye and refused to be afraid. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He would send no apology of his own, not yet. But neither, he decided, watching the rain streak down the glass. Would he let the matter rest as simply as Baron Colt seemed to wish? There was something about Eliza Whitmore that demanded a closer look, and the Duke of Ashcombe was not a man who ignored his own curiosity once it had been awakened. By morning, the story had already changed shape 3 times. In one version, whispered over breakfast tables across London, Eliza Whitmore had struck the Duke of Ashcombe in a fit of madness, screaming at him like a woman possessed. In another, she had thrown a glass of wine in his face before slapping him, though no wine had ever been thrown. In a third, the most cruel of all, it was said that she had tried to seduce him and been rejected, and the slap was nothing but the tantrum of a desperate woman scorned. None of it was true. All of it spread faster than the truth ever could. Eliza learned of the rumors from Charlotte, who came running into her room just after dawn, her face pale with worry, clutching a note that had been left at their door by an anonymous hand. The note contained no words of comfort, only a single cruel line copied from something that had apparently been said at a card party the previous evening. The Whitmore girl has finally proven what everyone always suspected, that poverty makes beasts of even the well-bred. Who would write such a thing? Charlotte asked, her voice trembling. Someone who wants to see us fall, Eliza said, folding the note carefully and setting it aside. Someone who has been waiting for an excuse. She did not have to wait long to learn who that someone might be. By midday, invitations that had once arrived weekly, invitations to teas, to musical evenings, to small gatherings among families of modest but respectable standing, had stopped arriving altogether. A neighbor who had always greeted Eliza warmly in the street now crossed to the opposite side rather than meet her eyes. Even the local shopkeeper, a kind man who had extended credit to the Whitmore family more than once, grew suddenly formal and distant when Eliza came to settle a small account. Word had reached the household that Charlotte's own engagement, a match to a modest but well-regarded young gentleman named Edward Farrow, was now in jeopardy. The Farrow family, eager to protect their own reputation, had sent a carefully worded letter, suggesting that perhaps, given recent events, it would be wise to delay the formal announcement until matters had settled. Delay, their mother repeated bitterly, reading the letter aloud at the dinner table that evening. They do not mean delay. They mean cancel, dressed in politer words. Charlotte set down her fork, her appetite gone. Perhaps if Eliza apologized, she said quietly, not meeting her sister's eyes. Perhaps if she simply said the words, even if she did not mean them, it might be enough to satisfy the Duke, and everything could return to how it was. The words landed harder than Eliza expected. She looked at her younger sister, at the worry etched into her young face, and felt the full weight of what her single act in that ballroom had cost, not just herself, but everyone she loved. "Charlotte," she said gently, "I am sorry that my actions have touched your happiness. I never intended that." "I know," Charlotte said, tears gathering in her eyes, "but intention does not undo what has already happened." Their father set down his own utensils, his expression heavy. "Eliza has already told me she will not apologize, and I will not force her to," he said firmly, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "But we must consider, as a family, what we will do if the scandal does not fade. We must consider whether it is time to leave London for a while, until people find some newer misfortune to entertain themselves with." The thought of leaving, of retreating from the city that had been her home for all of her 19 years, struck Eliza with unexpected sorrow. But she said nothing, only nodded, understanding that her father's suggestion came not from anger, but from the exhausted love of a man trying desperately to protect the people he had already failed to protect financially. That night, unable to sleep, Eliza wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped out into the small garden behind their townhouse. The air was cool and smelled of rain, though the sky above had cleared, scattered with pale stars. She sat on the old stone bench beneath the bare apple tree and allowed herself, finally, to weep, quietly, so that no one inside the house would hear. She was not weeping for herself. She had made her choice, and she did not regret it. She wept for Charlotte, whose future now hung uncertain because of it, and for her mother, whose hands had trembled with worry every day since, and for her father, who had once commanded respect in every room he entered, and now flinched at the sound of the front door, fearing what fresh news it might bring. A sound in the alley beyond the garden wall made her lift her head. A carriage had stopped there, quiet and unmarked, and for a moment Eliza wondered if some further insult had been sent to their door in the dead of night. But no letter came. Instead, she heard the soft click of a door opening, and the shape of a man stepped down and stood for a long moment near the wall, simply looking toward the house. Eliza rose slowly from the bench, her heart quickening. "Who is there?" The figure did not answer. After a moment, he stepped back into the shadows, and the carriage pulled away without a sound, leaving only the faint impression that she had imagined the entire thing. She had not imagined it. Someone had come, and someone had watched, and though she did not yet know it, the man who had stood in the shadow of her garden wall was the very man whose cheek still bore the faint memory of her hand. The Duke of Ashcombe had told himself, riding home through the quiet streets, that his visit had accomplished nothing, that he had learned nothing new by watching a modest townhouse from the shadows like a common thief in the night. And yet he found himself thinking, long after he had returned to his own grand and empty halls, of the sound of quiet weeping carried faintly on the night air, and the proud, unbroken way she had lifted her head the moment she suspected she was being watched. He had come intending only to observe. He left with the uncomfortable sense that he had been the one observed all along, seen through to something in himself he had not examined in a very long time. The following days brought no relief. Baron Colt, whose interest in the Whitmore family had always seemed strange to Eliza, though she could never say precisely why, began appearing with curious frequency wherever she went. He offered condolences dressed as kindness, sympathy dressed as concern, and beneath every carefully chosen word, Eliza sensed something calculating, something patient, like a man waiting for exactly the right moment to make his true intentions known. "You must not let the gossips wound you too deeply, Miss Whitmore," he said one afternoon, having arranged, with suspicious ease, to encounter her outside the milliner's shop. "Society forgets quickly, when given a reason to forget." "And what reason might that be, Lord Colt?" Eliza asked, watching him carefully. He smiled, and something in the smile made her skin prickle with unease. "Perhaps a new alliance," he said. "One that reminds society of your family's worth, rather than its misfortune. I have long admired your family's old claim to the eastern grazing lands, Miss Whitmore. It would be a shame to see such a claim lost entirely to debt." Eliza said nothing, though the mention of the grazing lands, a piece of property tied to old and half-forgotten legal papers her father rarely spoke of, struck her as strange. She thanked him politely and hurried home, uncertain why his words left her more unsettled than any cruel rumor had managed to do. She did not yet understand that Baron Colt's interest in her family had little to do with kindness, and everything to do with a legal claim buried in old documents that, if uncovered, would prove far more valuable than any dowry. But she felt, deep in her bones, that something beneath the surface of her ruined reputation was shifting, quietly, dangerously, and that the slap she had delivered in that ballroom had set into motion far more than she could yet see. That evening, her father called her into his small study, a cramped room lined with old ledgers and yellowed papers he rarely allowed anyone to touch. He looked older than she remembered, the candlelight carving deep shadows beneath his eyes. "Baron Colt spoke to you today," he said. It was not a question. "He mentioned the eastern grazing lands," Eliza said carefully. "I did not understand why." Her father was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of an old leather-bound ledger on his desk. "Your grandfather held a claim to that land long before the war," he said finally. "A claim that was never properly settled, tangled up in old promises made by men long since dead. I always believed it worthless, a relic not worth the trouble of pursuing. But if Lord Colt has taken an interest, then perhaps I was wrong. Do you think he means us harm?" "I think," her father said slowly, "that men like Baron Colt rarely offer kindness without expecting something greater in return. Be careful of him, Eliza. Be far more careful of him than you were of the Duke." Eliza left the study troubled, the warning settling uneasily in her chest. She had spent so many days bracing herself against the cruelty of the Duke of Ashcombe that she had scarcely considered the danger might come instead from a man wearing a gentle smile. 2 days later, a small mercy arrived, quiet and unexpected. A letter came from an old family friend, a widow named Constance Hale who had known Eliza's mother since girlhood, and who had heard, through her own web of correspondence, that the Duke had made no further move to press his demand for a public apology. The silence, Mrs. Hale suggested, might mean he had simply lost interest, distracted by some new matter of business or pleasure. Eliza wanted desperately to believe it, but she found herself thinking often of the carriage that had paused outside their garden wall in the dead of night, of the shape of the man who had stood watching before vanishing into the dark, and she could not shake the feeling that the Duke of Ashcombe had not lost interest at all. She was right, though she would not learn how right for some time yet. For even as Baron Colt tightened his quiet campaign around her family's fortunes, the Duke of Ashcombe had begun, in his own careful and guarded way, an investigation of his own, one that would soon uncover a secret neither Eliza nor her father had ever fully understood. The Duke of Ashcombe rarely visited his own family archive, a cold stone room at the rear of the estate where generations of documents sat gathering dust beneath sheets of oiled cloth. But 3 days after the ballroom scandal, unable to rid himself of the memory of Eliza Whitmore's unshaken eyes, he found himself there, candle in hand, searching through boxes his father had never spoken of. It was his estate steward, a quiet and observant man named Robert Hale, no relation to the widow who had written to the Whitmores, who first mentioned the name. "Whitmore," the steward said, pausing over an old military record. "I recall the name from your late father's papers, Your Grace. A Colonel Whitmore served alongside your father during the campaign in the North, many years ago now." The Duke's interest sharpened at once. "Continue." The steward found the record after nearly an hour of searching, a faded letter tucked between the pages of an old campaign ledger, written in his father's own hand. The Duke read it twice, then a third time, his expression growing more troubled with each reading. The letter described, in the plain and unembellished language of a man recording facts he found difficult to speak aloud, a night during the Northern campaign when the elder Duke of Ashcombe had been separated from his regiment, wounded and alone in enemy territory, certain he would not survive until morning. It was Colonel Whitmore, Eliza's own grandfather, who had found him, carried him nearly 2 miles through hostile ground, and delivered him safely back to his men, refusing any reward or recognition for the act. "My debt to Colonel Whitmore can never be repaid in coin," the letter read, "for he asked for none, and would accept none. But should his family ever stand in need, and should this letter reach the hands of my son, let it be known that the honor of Ashcombe is bound to the honor of Whitmore, whether the world remembers it or not." The Duke set the letter down slowly, his hands unsteady in a way he was not accustomed to. He had mocked her. In front of 200 witnesses, he had mocked the granddaughter of the man who had saved his own father's life, and he had done so without the faintest knowledge of the debt his family carried. "Does anyone else know of this?" he asked the steward, his voice quieter than usual. "I do not believe so, Your Grace. Your father was not a man who spoke often of the war." The Duke stood for a long while in the cold archive room, the candle guttering low, turning the letter over in his hands as though it might reveal some further secret, if only he studied it long enough. He thought of the ballroom, of his own cruel words about her father's failing fortune, of the laughter that had followed, laughter he had, in some measure, invited. He thought, too, of Baron Colt, who had come to him only that morning with unusual eagerness, urging him to press the matter of the slap formally, to demand a public apology that would humiliate the Whitmore family completely and permanently. At the time, the Duke had assumed Colt's eagerness sprang from simple loyalty, a friend defending his honor. Now, staring at his father's letter, he began to wonder what Baron Colt truly stood to gain from the Whitmore family's total ruin. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his study long past midnight, weighing what he had learned against what he had already set into motion. Pride told him to say nothing, to let the scandal fade quietly, to protect his own reputation by never admitting how badly he had misjudged the situation. But something else, something newer and less familiar, urged him to act. He resolved, before the candle burned out entirely, that he would learn more about Eliza Whitmore before he decided anything further. Not through gossip, not through the careful reports of servants sent to watch her house, but through his own eyes, in his own way, without the weight of his title standing between them. It was not a difficult thing to arrange. The Duke possessed an old townhouse in a quieter part of the city, inherited from a distant cousin and rarely used, where he was known to almost no one. He instructed his valet to prepare simple, unremarkable clothing, the sort worn by a modest gentleman of business rather than a duke, and he took the name Henry Doyle, a name that meant nothing to anyone, a name that carried no weight and demanded no bowing. His first sight of her, 3 days later, came not in a ballroom but in a narrow street near the edge of the poorer parish, where Eliza had gone, as she did twice each week, to help a small group of women who cared for the sick and the elderly, who had no family left to tend them. The Duke, disguised as Henry Doyle, had positioned himself near a bookseller's stall, with a clear view of the modest building where the women gathered, and he watched as Eliza arrived carrying a basket of bread and simple medicines, her plain gray gown replaced by an even plainer dress, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. He watched her spend nearly 3 hours inside that building. When she emerged, she was laughing gently at something an old woman had said, her face lit with a warmth he had never once seen in any ballroom, a warmth that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine feeling. He found himself returning the following week, and the week after that, always at a careful distance, always unseen, telling himself each time that this would be the last visit, that he had learned enough, that his curiosity had been satisfied. Each time, he found some new reason to return. It was during his third visit that he witnessed something that changed the shape of his growing admiration into something closer to concern. As Eliza left the parish building, a man Ashcombe recognized instantly, despite the shadows, approached her in the narrow street. Baron Edmund Colt. The Duke moved closer, careful to stay hidden behind a passing cart, straining to hear the exchange. "You look tired, Miss Whitmore," Colt was saying, his voice smooth and warm in a way that did not match the calculating look in his eyes. "Charity work is admirable, but surely a woman in your position should be conserving her strength for more pressing matters. Your family's debts will not resolve themselves through good deeds alone." "I am aware of our circumstances, Lord Colt," Eliza said, her tone polite but guarded. "I do not require reminding." "Of course not," Colt said smoothly. "I only wish to help, in whatever way I am able. I have spoken with several gentlemen of my acquaintance who might be persuaded to overlook recent unpleasantness, for the right consideration. A generous settlement regarding your family's old land claim would go a long way toward restoring your good name." "And what would you require in exchange for arranging such generosity?" Eliza asked, her voice sharpening slightly. Colt smiled, and even from a distance, the Duke felt a chill at the sight of it. "Only your trust, Miss Whitmore, and perhaps, in time, a closer alliance between our two families." Eliza stepped back, putting a firm distance between herself and the Baron. "I thank you for your concern, Lord Colt, but I must return home. My mother expects me." She walked away quickly, and Colt watched her go with an expression the Duke did not like at all, patient and calculating, the look of a man content to wait, certain that time and desperation would eventually deliver what charm alone could not. The Duke remained hidden until Colt had gone, his mind working quickly. He understood now, with growing certainty, that Colt's interest in the Whitmore family had nothing to do with kindness, and everything to do with the old land claim his own steward had briefly mentioned weeks before. A claim that, if properly pursued, might prove considerably valuable, particularly if secured through marriage rather than costly legal battle. He returned to his own estate that night deeply unsettled, no longer certain which mattered more, the debt his family owed to Eliza's grandfather, or the growing and uncomfortable realization that he did not wish to see her fall into Baron Colt's hands for any reason at all. The following afternoon, disguised once more as the plain and unremarkable Henry Doyle, the Duke arranged what appeared to be a chance encounter outside the same bookseller's stall where he had spent so many hours watching. Eliza passed by exactly as she did every week, and this time, he stepped forward. "Forgive me," he said, bowing slightly, careful to keep his voice pitched differently than she might remember from the ballroom, though in truth they had exchanged so few words that night, beyond his own cruelty, that he doubted she would recognize his voice at all. "I believe you dropped this." He held out a small book, one he had purchased only moments before for exactly this purpose, a worn copy of poetry he had noticed her glancing toward through the stall window. Eliza looked at the book, then at him, confusion crossing her face. "I do not believe that is mine, sir." "No," he admitted, allowing a small, careful smile. "It is not. I confess I invented the excuse. I noticed you admiring it through the window, and I thought perhaps you might enjoy owning it more than I would enjoy leaving it unsold on that shelf." Eliza studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to be offended or amused. Something in her expression suggested she had grown weary of pretense, weary of the careful games played by London society, and found his honesty, however strange its delivery, oddly refreshing. "That is a very unusual way to introduce yourself, sir," she said finally. "Henry Doyle," he said, offering the name easily, surprised at how naturally it settled on his tongue. "A gentleman of business, presently between engagements, and evidently poor at judging which books belong to strangers." A small, reluctant smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since that terrible night in the ballroom. "Eliza Whitmore," she said, "and I suppose, since you have already purchased it, it would be rude of me to refuse the book." "Extremely rude," he agreed. She accepted the book, turning it over gently in her hands, and for the first time since the letter in the archive room, The Duke of Ashcombe felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been tight and unresolved since the moment her hand had struck his cheek. He did not yet know where this small deception would lead, or how deeply he would come to regret the weight of the false name resting between them. But standing there in the quiet street, watching her smile at a simple gift, he found himself wanting, more than he had wanted anything in a very long time, to see that smile again. In the weeks that followed, Henry Doyle became a quiet and steady presence in Eliza's life, though she could never have explained, even to herself, how such a stranger had so quickly become someone she looked forward to seeing. He appeared near the bookseller's stall most weeks, sometimes waiting outside the parish building where she volunteered, always with some small excuse for the meeting, a returned handkerchief, a question about a street name, an opinion on a book she had just finished reading. He was unlike any man she had known in London society. He asked no questions about her family's finances, made no veiled remarks about her modest clothing, expressed no interest in whether her sister's engagement would survive the scandal still clinging to their name. Instead, he asked what she thought of the books she read, what she hoped for beyond the narrow expectations placed on a woman of her station, whether she believed kindness could survive in a city that seemed to reward cruelty so richly. "You ask strange questions, Mr. Doyle," she told him one afternoon, as they walked slowly along a quiet lane near the parish, autumn leaves scattering across the cobblestones. "Do I?" he said. "I find most people in this city ask only about money, or marriage, or whose reputation has crumbled most recently. I confess I find those questions rather dull. And what do you find interesting, if not those things?" He considered the question seriously, as though it deserved more than a passing answer. "I find it interesting," he said finally, "that a woman who has been so publicly humiliated, who has watched her family's fortunes crumble further because of a single moment of honesty, still spends her mornings tending to the sick and her afternoons defending her sister from unwanted attention. I find it interesting that you have not once, in all our conversations, spoken bitterly of the man who caused your ruin." Eliza's steps slowed. "You know of the scandal, then?" "All of London knows of the scandal, Miss Whitmore. I would have to be a very poor listener not to have heard it." She looked away, embarrassed, though something in his tone held no judgment, only curiosity. "I am not bitter toward him," she said slowly, surprising herself with the admission. "I was angry that night. I am still angry, when I think of it too closely. But bitterness requires a kind of attention I cannot afford to spend. I have my mother's worry to manage, and my sister's future to protect, and I find there is simply no room left for hatred, however well earned it might be." Henry Doyle was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "That is a rare kind of strength," he said finally. "It does not feel like strength," Eliza admitted. "Most days it feels like exhaustion dressed in nicer clothing." He laughed then, a genuine and unguarded sound, and Eliza found herself smiling, despite the ache that still lived beneath her ribs whenever she thought too long about the state of her family's fortunes. Their meetings continued through the following weeks, quiet and careful, never announced to anyone, never occurring anywhere Eliza might be recognized by those who moved in her old social circles. She told herself, at first, that Henry Doyle was simply a pleasant distraction from the misery pressing in on every side of her life. But as the weeks passed, she began to notice the way her heart quickened whenever she caught sight of him waiting near the bookseller's stall, the way she found herself saving small observations throughout her day, simply so she might share them with him later. She did not know his true occupation, only that he claimed to manage business interests that kept him frequently traveling, and she did not press him for details he seemed reluctant to share. She told herself it did not matter. A gentleman of modest business, however mysterious his exact circumstances, posed no threat to her family's already fragile reputation, so long as their meetings remained private. She was wrong, though she would not learn how wrong until it was far too late to prevent what followed. Baron Colt had not abandoned his pursuit of the Whitmore family's old land claim, nor his quiet campaign to secure Eliza's hand through whatever means proved most effective. When charm and false concern failed to move her, he turned his attention toward information instead, hiring a discreet man to watch the Whitmore household and report anything of interest. It did not take long for the watcher to notice the pattern of Eliza's weekly visits to the parish building, nor the unremarkable gentleman who so frequently appeared to greet her there. Baron Colt, upon receiving this report, felt a slow and satisfied smile spread across his face. A secret meeting, conducted in private, away from any chaperone or witness, was precisely the sort of leverage a patient man could put to excellent use. He did not yet know the true identity of the mysterious Henry Doyle, But he intended to find out, certain that whatever he uncovered would prove valuable, one way or another. Meanwhile, within the grand halls of the Ashcombe estate, the Duke found himself increasingly torn between two identities he could no longer keep entirely separate. As the Duke of Ashcombe, he was expected to attend endless social functions, to entertain proposals of alliance from ambitious families eager to secure his favor, to maintain the cold and commanding presence that had defined him for years. As Henry Doyle, he found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, genuinely happy, free from the weight of expectation, able to speak and laugh and listen without calculating how his words might be repeated or twisted by London's endless gossip. The two lives grew increasingly difficult to balance. More than once he arrived late to important meetings with his steward, his mind still lingering on some small observation Eliza had shared during their most recent walk. More than once he caught himself, in the middle of some tedious social obligation, wondering what she might think of the conversation unfolding around him, certain she would find the empty flattery as tiresome as he did. He knew, with growing unease, that the deception could not continue indefinitely. Eventually, Eliza would learn the truth, either from his own mouth or from someone else's, and he could not predict which outcome frightened him more. He resolved, more than once, to tell her himself, to end the charade before it grew any more tangled. Each time, standing before her in the quiet lane near the parish, watching her face light with the particular warmth she reserved only for Henry Doyle, his resolve faltered. He told himself he needed more time, that the truth would keep, that there would be a better moment to reveal what he had done. He did not know that Baron Colt's watcher had already begun following him, nor that the careful web of deception he had built was already beginning, quietly, to unravel. It was Charlotte who first noticed the change in her sister, the lightness that had crept back into Eliza's step despite the ongoing scandal, the small smile that sometimes crossed her face for no apparent reason. She said nothing at first, watching carefully, until one evening, finding Eliza humming softly to herself while mending a torn hem, curiosity finally overcame her discretion. "You have met someone," Charlotte said, setting down her own needlework. It was not a question. Eliza's hands stilled. "I do not know what you mean, Eliza. I have shared a room with you since I was old enough to walk. I know the difference between your ordinary face and the face you wear now." Charlotte leaned forward, her eyes bright with cautious hope. "Who is he?" Eliza hesitated, torn between the comfort of confiding in her sister and the fear that speaking the secret aloud might somehow break whatever fragile thing she had found. Finally, she set down her mending and told Charlotte everything. The chance meeting outside the bookseller's stall, the quiet walks, the easy conversation unburdened by titles or scandal or expectation. "He sounds kind," Charlotte said softly when Eliza had finished. "Kinder than most men in London seem capable of being." "He is," Eliza said, "kinder than I expected to find, given everything that has happened." "Do you love him?" The question startled Eliza, though she found, turning it over in her mind, that the answer came more easily than she expected. "I believe I might," she admitted quietly. "Though I scarcely know anything true about his circumstances, only the way he makes me feel when we speak." Charlotte reached over and took her sister's hand. "Then perhaps, for once, something good has come from that terrible night at the ballroom." Eliza wanted very much to believe her sister was right. She did not yet know that the very secrecy protecting her fragile happiness was the same secrecy that Baron Colt intended to use as a weapon, nor that the man she had come to trust so completely was carrying a deception large enough to shatter everything they had built together, the moment it finally came to light. Baron Colt's watcher, a former clerk with a talent for patience and an even greater talent for discretion, spent nearly 2 weeks tracing the movements of the man calling himself Henry Doyle. It was not easy work. The gentleman appeared and disappeared with unusual care, favoring quiet streets and unremarkable entrances, never once returning to the same lodging house twice in the same week. The breakthrough came by accident, on an ordinary evening when the watcher, following at a careful distance, observed Henry Doyle entering not a modest gentleman's residence, but the grand rear gate of the Ashcombe estate itself, greeted at the door by a footman who addressed him, in a moment of careless familiarity, as, "Your Grace." The watcher could scarcely believe his good fortune. He returned to Baron Colt that same night, breathless with the weight of what he had discovered. Colt listened to the report in complete silence, his expression unreadable, and when the watcher had finished, a slow smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that promised nothing good for anyone standing between him and what he wanted. "The Duke of Ashcombe," Colt murmured, almost to himself, playing at being a common gentleman, Courting Eliza Whitmore in secret, under a false name. He laughed softly, shaking his head. Even I did not anticipate such a delicious complication. He dismissed the watcher with generous payment and sat alone for a long while, turning the information over in his mind, considering how best to make use of it. He could reveal the deception quietly, privately, using it to pressure the Duke into some arrangement favorable to his own interests. Or he could reveal it publicly, in the most damaging way possible, destroying Eliza's reputation so thoroughly that she would have no choice but to accept whatever protection he offered, grateful for any escape from complete ruin. The second option, he decided, held far greater promise. He waited 3 more days, gathering additional details, confirming his information beyond any possibility of doubt, before setting his plan into motion. He chose, for maximum effect, a formal gathering at the home of Lady Pemberton, one of the most respected hostesses in London, an event certain to draw a substantial and influential crowd, including several members of the royal court. Eliza attended reluctantly, having received an unexpected invitation that surprised her given the ongoing scandal, though her mother insisted it would be foolish to refuse any opportunity to demonstrate that the Whitmore family still belonged, however precariously, within respectable society. She had no way of knowing what awaited her. The evening began ordinarily enough, polite conversation and careful smiles, the familiar tension of moving through a room full of people who remembered, all too well, the sound of a slap echoing off marble floors. Eliza kept close to her mother and Charlotte, speaking little, hoping only to survive the evening without further incident. Baron Colt made his move just as the musicians paused between pieces, when the room had grown quiet enough for a raised voice to carry to every corner. "Miss Whitmore," he called out, his tone carrying a false warmth that immediately drew attention from those nearby. "I wonder if you might share with our gathering the identity of the gentleman you have been meeting so frequently, and so privately, these past weeks. A Mr. Henry Doyle, I believe he calls himself." Eliza's blood ran cold. Conversation around them faltered, heads turning with the particular hunger of a crowd sensing fresh scandal. "I do not know what you mean, Lord Colt," she managed, though her voice wavered slightly. "Do you not?" Colt's smile widened, cruel beneath its polished surface. "How strange. My sources are quite certain of the meetings, quite certain of the name, and quite certain that the gentleman in question is rather more significant than a simple man of business." He paused, letting the silence stretch, savoring the growing attention of the room. "The name Henry Doyle, you see, is nothing but a mask. The man beneath it is the Duke of Ashcombe himself." A wave of gasps and murmurs swept through the gathering. Eliza felt the room tilt slightly, her ears ringing, unable to process the words she had just heard. "That cannot be true," she said, though even as she spoke, fragments began arranging themselves in her mind, small details she had dismissed or ignored. The easy authority in his manner, the fine quality of clothing he claimed belonged to a modest gentleman of business, the careful way he had always avoided answering direct questions about his family or his occupation. "I assure you, it is entirely true," Colt said, clearly delighted by her visible distress. "It seems the same man who mocked you so cruelly in this very room, weeks ago, has since been courting you in secret under a false identity, meeting you alone, unchaperoned, in narrow streets and quiet corners, all while allowing you to believe him nothing more than a common gentleman." He shook his head with mock sympathy. "One wonders what his true intentions might have been, Miss Whitmore. Perhaps this was never courtship at all, but merely another form of cruelty, a game played at your expense for his own private amusement." The room erupted into whispered speculation, and Eliza felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising in her chest, sharper now than it had ever been on the night of the slap, because this time the wound came not from a stranger's cruelty but from betrayal by someone she had come to trust completely. She did not see the Duke of Ashcombe arrive, but she heard the sudden hush that fell across the room as he entered, still dressed in the fine clothing befitting his true rank, his expression carefully composed despite the tension visible in his jaw. His eyes found Eliza immediately across the crowded room, and for a moment, something like regret flickered across his face before he schooled his features back into practiced calm. "Baron Colt speaks the truth," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "I am the man Miss Whitmore has known these past weeks as Henry Doyle." The confirmation sent a fresh wave of murmurs rippling through the crowd. Eliza stood frozen, staring at him, unable to reconcile the man before her, cold and composed in his fine clothing, with the gentle, curious companion she had grown to trust during their quiet walks near the parish. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though it carried far enough in the sudden silence that everyone present heard it. "Why would you deceive me this way?" The Duke stepped closer, seemingly unaware or uncaring of the audience watching their every word. "I did not intend deception, not in the way you believe," he said. "I learned, shortly after the ballroom, of a debt my family owed to yours, a debt from long before either of us was born. I wished to know you, truly, without the weight of my title standing between us." "You wish to know me," Eliza repeated, her voice shaking now with anger rather than shock. "You watched me, followed me, arranged false meetings under a false name, all while allowing me to believe I had found someone honest, someone different from the cruelty I encountered from you that first night. And you call this something other than deception?" "Eliza, you do not have permission to use my given name, Your Grace," she said, the formal title landing like a slap of its own. "You never did." The Duke's composure cracked slightly at that, pain visible beneath his carefully maintained calm. "I understand your anger. I have earned it. But I ask you to believe that whatever I felt during those weeks, whatever grew between us, was entirely real, regardless of the name I carried." Baron Colt, watching the exchange with evident satisfaction, chose that moment to press his advantage further. "How convenient," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "A duke, humiliated once by a woman of modest fortune, now claims genuine affection after months of secret deception. One might wonder, Your Grace, whether this sudden declaration serves any purpose beyond salvaging your own reputation, now that the truth has come to light." The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and calculated, and Eliza saw, with sudden and terrible clarity, exactly what Baron Colt had engineered. He had not simply exposed a secret. He had constructed a narrative in which she appeared either as a foolish woman deceived for sport, or worse, as a scheming opportunist who had somehow trapped a duke into false affection, either version certain to destroy what remained of her family's reputation completely. "I will not stand here and be used as a weapon in whatever game you are playing, Lord Colt," Eliza said, drawing herself up despite the humiliation burning through her. "Nor will I stand here and be spoken of as though I have no voice in my own circumstances." She turned and walked from the room, her back straight, her steps steady despite the trembling she felt beneath her composed exterior, leaving behind a gathering buzzing with scandal, and a duke who stood frozen, watching her go, understanding with sudden and devastating clarity that his carefully guarded secret had cost him something he had only just begun to recognize as precious. He did not follow her that night. He understood, watching her disappear through the crowded doorway, that pursuing her now would only deepen the very wound Baron Colt had so carefully engineered. Instead, he remained, forcing himself to meet the curious and judgmental stares of the gathered crowd, his mind working furiously to understand what Baron Colt truly hoped to gain from such a carefully orchestrated humiliation. It did not take him long to arrive at the answer. The following morning, his steward returned with confirmation of what the Duke had already begun to suspect, that Baron Colt had spent considerable effort investigating an old and largely forgotten legal claim belonging to the Whitmore family, a claim to valuable grazing land that, if secured through marriage rather than costly legal proceedings, would prove enormously profitable. Baron Colt had not exposed the secret out of loyalty or moral concern. He had exposed it to destroy Eliza's reputation so thoroughly that she would have no choice but to accept whatever protection he offered, believing herself abandoned by the Duke and cornered by circumstance, grateful for any escape from complete social ruin. The Duke sat alone in his study that morning, the weight of his own foolishness settling heavily across his shoulders. He had spent weeks building something honest and unguarded, only to see it shattered in a single evening by his own failure to reveal the truth sooner, and by his own blindness to Baron Colt's true intentions. He understood now that silence, however tempting, would only complete the damage Colt had begun. If he wished to protect Eliza, truly protect her, and not merely his own comfort, he would need to do far more than simply confirm the truth of his identity in a crowded drawing room. He would need to stand before all of London, and if necessary, before the king himself, and declare exactly what Eliza Whitmore's family had done for his own, and exactly what she meant to him now, regardless of the cost to his own carefully guarded pride. News of the scandal at Lady Pemberton's gathering spread through London faster than any rumor before it. By the following afternoon, every drawing room in the city buzzed with the story of the Duke who had courted a ruined woman under a false name, and the woman herself became, once again, the subject of every wagging tongue in society. Though the tone of the gossip had shifted in ways Eliza found almost harder to bear than outright cruelty, some pitied her as a fool deceived. Others whispered darkly that she had known his identity from the beginning, that the entire affair had been a calculated scheme to trap a duke into marriage, Eliza remained inside the townhouse for 3 days, unable to face the city that seemed determined to reshape her pain into whatever story proved most entertaining. Charlotte sat with her often, saying little, simply offering quiet companionship. Her mother, for once, did not press her to apologize or explain, seeming to understand that this wound ran deeper than any scandal that had come before it. On the 4th day, a letter arrived, sealed with the unmistakable crest of the Ashcombe family. Eliza stared at it for a long while before finally breaking the seal. The letter contained no excuses, no attempt to minimize what he had done. The Duke wrote plainly of his father's debt to her grandfather, of his own shame at having mocked her without knowledge of that debt, of the weeks spent watching her from a careful distance before finally approaching her under a false name, a decision he now recognized as cowardice, dressed as good intention. He wrote of the genuine warmth he had come to feel during their quiet conversations, warmth he insisted had nothing to do with any title, real or invented. And he wrote, finally, of his intention to correct the damage Baron Colt had caused, regardless of what it might cost his own reputation. I understand if you cannot forgive the manner of my deception, the letter concluded, but I will not allow Baron Colt's lies to stand unchallenged, nor will I allow your family's honor to be sacrificed to protect my own comfort. Whatever you decide regarding my own conduct, know that the truth will be spoken plainly, before whoever will listen, including His Majesty himself, should the matter require it. Eliza read the letter 3 times before setting it aside, uncertain what to feel. Anger still lived within her, sharp and unresolved. But beneath the anger, something else stirred as well, a reluctant recognition that the man who had written these words seemed genuinely different from the cold figure who had mocked her in that ballroom so many weeks before. She did not have long to decide how to respond. 2 days later, an official summons arrived, addressed to the entire Whitmore family, requesting their presence at a formal gathering of the royal court, where matters concerning several noble families were to be formally addressed. Eliza's father read the summons with visible alarm, uncertain whether it represented rescue or further ruin. "We cannot refuse a royal summons," he said grimly. "Whatever awaits us there, we must face it together." The great hall of the royal court was more grand than anything Eliza had ever witnessed, marble columns rising toward a painted ceiling, courtiers arranged in careful rows, the king himself seated upon a raised dais, flanked by advisors and guards. Eliza stood beside her family near the back of the assembled crowd, her heart pounding, uncertain what role she was meant to play in whatever unfolded. Baron Colt was present as well, standing near the front of the gathering with evident confidence, clearly believing he had already secured whatever advantage he sought. When the formal business of the court had concluded, he stepped forward, requesting permission to address a matter of personal honor. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall, "I bring before this court a matter concerning the conduct of the Duke of Ashcombe, who has engaged in deception unbecoming of his rank, courting a young woman of modest fortune under a false identity, exposing her to public humiliation through his own dishonesty." Eliza felt her stomach tighten as every eye in the hall turned toward her. The king, an older man with sharp, observant eyes, studied Colt for a long moment before speaking. "And what remedy do you propose, Lord Colt?" "I propose," Colt said smoothly, "that the Duke be required to publicly apologize for the harm caused to Miss Whitmore's reputation, and that the matter of the Whitmore family's disputed land claim be settled through appropriate legal channels, given the family's evident inability to manage their own affairs with dignity." The final words landed with calculated cruelty, and Eliza understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what Colt intended. He meant to use this public forum to strip her family of the land claim entirely, wrapping his true motive in the language of concern for her damaged reputation. Before anyone could respond, the Duke of Ashcombe stepped forward from among the assembled nobles, his expression calm but resolute. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing formally before the throne, "I do not dispute that my conduct caused Miss Whitmore harm. I courted her under a false name, and I did so without her knowledge or consent regarding my true identity. For that deception, I owe her a genuine apology, which I offer freely and without reservation." He turned then, facing Eliza directly across the crowded hall, and something in his expression made the room fall utterly silent. "But I will not allow Baron Colt to use my own failings as a weapon against her family's honor," he continued, "for there is a debt owed between our families that predates this scandal by more than 20 years, a debt I only recently discovered, hidden within my own father's private papers." He proceeded to tell the assembled court the story he had learned in the cold archive room weeks before of Colonel Whitmore's courage during the Northern Campaign, Of the wounded young officer he had carried nearly 2 miles to safety, refusing all reward. Of the letter his father had left behind, declaring the honor of Ashcombe forever bound to the honor of Whitmore. A murmur swept through the hall as the Duke spoke, courtiers exchanging glances, clearly moved by the tale of long-forgotten sacrifice. I mocked Miss Whitmore's family cruelly, in a public ballroom, without any knowledge of what her grandfather had done for my own father, the Duke continued. She responded not with tears or apology, but with the only honest reaction anyone in that room offered me that night. She struck me, and she was right to do so. In the weeks since, I have come to know her not as a woman deserving of scandal, but as someone whose courage and kindness far exceed anything I have encountered among the flattery and pretense of London society. He paused, glancing briefly toward Baron Colt before continuing. As for the matter of the disputed land claim, I would ask this court to consider carefully why Lord Colt has taken such sudden and passionate interest in a family's private legal affairs, particularly given the considerable value such land would hold, were it secured through marriage rather than costly legal dispute. The implication landed clearly, and Eliza watched Baron Colt's confident expression falter for the first time, color rising in his face as murmurs of suspicion began circulating through the gathered court. The king, who had listened to the entire exchange with careful attention, finally raised a hand for silence. Lord Colt, he said, his voice carrying quiet authority, it appears your concern for Miss Whitmore's reputation may not have been entirely without self-interest. Your Majesty, I assure you, I have heard quite enough assurance for one afternoon, the king said, cutting him off with a tone that brooked no argument. This court will look further into the matter of your sudden interest in the Whitmore family's land claim, Lord Colt, and I would advise you to consider carefully how you answer any questions that follow. Colt bowed stiffly, his face pale, retreating several steps into the crowd, his earlier confidence entirely drained away. The king then turned his attention toward Eliza, who stood frozen near the back of the hall, scarcely able to believe the events unfolding before her. Miss Whitmore, he said, please step forward. Eliza's legs felt unsteady as she moved through the parting crowd, every eye in the hall following her progress toward the throne. She sank into a careful curtsy before the king, her heart pounding so loudly she felt certain everyone nearby must hear it. I have heard much of you these past weeks, the king said, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, a woman who struck a duke for insulting her family, and who has since shown remarkable grace under considerable public cruelty. Tell me plainly, Miss Whitmore, what do you wish from this court today? Eliza hesitated only a moment before answering, drawing on the same steady resolve that had carried her through every difficult moment since that terrible night in the ballroom. I wish only for my family's name to be judged fairly, Your Majesty, based on our own conduct, and not on rumor or scandal manufactured for another man's gain. A faint smile touched the king's face, brief but unmistakable. A fair request, and reasonably spoken. He rose slowly from his throne, and the entire hall fell into stunned silence as he descended the steps of the dais, approaching Eliza directly. It is not often, he said, loud enough for the entire court to hear, that this court encounters honesty as plain and unshaken as the honesty your grandfather showed on a northern battlefield 20 years ago, or the honesty you yourself showed in a crowded ballroom weeks past. Such honesty deserves recognition, not ridicule. To the astonishment of every courtier present, the king inclined his head and bowed, low and deliberate, before Eliza Whitmore. Gasps rippled through the hall. Eliza stood frozen, scarcely able to comprehend what she was witnessing, the king of the realm bowing before her, a woman who, only months before, had been mocked and laughed at in a crowded ballroom for daring to defend her family's honor. When the king straightened, he addressed the court once more. Let it be known that the Whitmore family's claim to the eastern grazing lands is confirmed and settled in their favor, free of any further dispute. And let it further be known that any further insult offered to this family's name will be considered an insult offered to this court directly. The hall erupted into murmurs of astonishment, courtiers turning to whisper among themselves, the entire narrative of scandal and ruin reshaping itself in real time into something closer to triumph. Eliza's mother wept openly, clutching Charlotte's hand, while her father stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden and complete reversal of fortune. The Duke of Ashcombe crossed the hall slowly, stopping before Eliza once the king had returned to his throne, his expression uncertain in a way she had never seen from him before. I do not ask for your forgiveness, he said quietly, for her ears alone, though the entire court still watched with undisguised curiosity. I ask only for the chance to earn it, slowly, honestly, without any false name standing between us. Eliza studied him for a long moment, weighing the weight of his deception against the genuine warmth she had felt during their quiet weeks together, against the courage he had shown that very afternoon in defending her family before the entire court, risking his own reputation to correct a wrong neither of them had fully understood until it was nearly too late. "You have a great deal to prove, Your Grace," she said finally, though something in her voice had softened. "I intend to spend as long as necessary proving it," he said, and for the first time since the night of the slap, something like hope flickered genuinely in his eyes. Word of the king's judgment spread through London even faster than the original scandal had, and within days, the story of Eliza Whitmore transformed entirely, no longer the tale of a scandalous woman who had struck a duke in a fit of temper, but the story of a courageous woman whose honesty had ultimately been vindicated before the highest authority in the land. Invitations began arriving once more, though Eliza found she cared far less about them now than she once had. Charlotte's engagement to Edward Farrow was quietly restored, the Farrow family eager to align themselves once more with a name that had proven, in the end, to carry genuine honor. The Duke visited often in the months that followed, no longer hidden behind any false name, courting Eliza openly and patiently, earning back, slowly and honestly, the trust his deception had nearly destroyed. He never again mocked her modest circumstances, never again allowed pride to override honesty, and Eliza found, watching him grow gentler and more thoughtful with each passing month, that the man beneath the title had indeed been worth discovering all along. When he finally asked for her hand, nearly a year after that first terrible night in the ballroom, he did not offer jewels or grand declarations. He offered instead a simple, worn copy of poetry, the very book he had first given her outside the bookseller's stall, now inscribed with a single line in his own careful hand. For the woman whose honesty taught a duke, and eventually a king, the true meaning of honor, Eliza said yes, not because he was a duke, and not because her family's fortunes had been restored, but because she had come to know the man beneath both the title and the false name, and had found him, at last, worthy of the trust she had once been so reluctant to give. The wedding took place in early spring, in the small stone chapel near the Whitmore family's old country home, rather than the grand cathedral many had expected for a duke's marriage. It had been Eliza's request, quietly made and readily granted, and the duke had agreed without hesitation, understanding by then that grandeur meant little to the woman he loved, and that authenticity meant everything. The chapel was modest, its walls lined with simple stone rather than gilded ornament, but on that morning it seemed to Eliza more beautiful than any ballroom she had ever entered. Sunlight poured through narrow windows, catching dust motes that drifted like scattered gold above the small gathering of family and true friends. Charlotte stood beside her, radiant in a gown of pale blue, having married Edward Farrow only months before in a ceremony finally free of scandal or doubt. Their mother wept quietly through the entire service, though these tears, unlike so many that had come before, carried nothing but joy. Baron Colt had vanished from London society entirely by then, his reputation ruined beyond recovery once the court's investigation revealed the full extent of his scheming, not only against the Whitmore family, but against several others whose fortunes he had attempted to manipulate through similarly patient and calculated deception. He had fled to the continent within weeks of the king's judgment, and no one in London much mourned his absence. The Duke stood waiting at the altar as Eliza walked toward him, dressed simply, without the elaborate jewels or ornamentation many in her position might have chosen. He watched her approach with an expression of such open tenderness that several guests would later remark it was difficult to reconcile this man with the cold and cutting figure who had once mocked a poor young woman in a crowded ballroom. "You look nervous, Your Grace," Eliza murmured as she reached him, a teasing note in her voice that had become familiar over their months of courtship. "I have faced kings and courts without flinching," he murmured back, "yet somehow you unsettle me more than either." She smiled, and the ceremony began, simple and heartfelt, free of the pomp so often expected of noble weddings. When at last they were pronounced husband and wife, the small gathering erupted into genuine cheers, and Eliza felt, standing there in the golden light of that humble chapel, that every hardship of the past year had led her, deliberately and meaningfully, toward exactly this moment. Their life together in the months that followed proved far different from the cold, formal existence Eliza had once imagined might await any woman married into such high nobility. The Duke, having learned through painful experience the cost of pride and deception, made a quiet but deliberate effort to remain the same honest man Eliza had come to know as Henry Doyle, even as he carried out his duties as Duke of Ashcombe. He continued accompanying her, whenever his obligations allowed, to the parish where she still volunteered twice each week, no longer disguised, no longer hidden, simply present and genuinely engaged in the work that had first revealed to him her true character. He established, within the first year of their marriage, a modest fund dedicated to supporting families facing financial hardship through no fault of their own, quietly ensuring that no household would be forced into the kind of desperate circumstances the Whitmore family had once endured. He never spoke of it publicly, never sought recognition for the gesture, understanding that true honor required no audience. Eliza, for her part, found herself gradually welcomed back into society, though she approached her new position with far more caution and far less need for approval than she might once have felt necessary. She had learned, through the painful months following that first terrible slap, that the opinions of a ballroom full of strangers mattered far less than the steady respect of those who truly knew her character. She spoke plainly when plain speech was needed, refused to indulge in the cruel gossip that had once nearly destroyed her family, and gradually became known throughout London not as the scandalous woman who had struck a duke, but as a duchess of remarkable kindness and unshakable integrity. Her father's health improved steadily once the weight of debt and desperation had finally lifted from his shoulders, the settled land claim providing enough security that he could finally rest, free from the constant fear that had aged him so visibly during the difficult years before. He spent his remaining years quietly content, delighting in his grandchildren when they eventually arrived, often telling anyone who would listen the story of his own father's quiet heroism on a northern battlefield, a story that had, in the end, saved his family from ruin twice over. On the first anniversary of their wedding, the Duke surprised Eliza with a visit to the very street where they had first properly met as Henry Doyle and Eliza Whitmore, outside the same bookseller's stall, now slightly changed but still standing. "I owe this shop a great debt," he said, smiling as they walked slowly past the familiar window. "Without that foolish excuse about a dropped book, I might never have found the courage to speak with you at all. You might have simply introduced yourself honestly," Eliza pointed out, though there was no real reproach left in her voice, only fond amusement at a memory that had long since lost its power to wound. "I might have," he agreed, "but I doubt Eliza Whitmore would have given a duke the chance to prove himself worth knowing, not after the way that same duke had treated her only weeks before." Eliza considered this, watching the familiar street around them, remembering the fear and uncertainty of those early weeks, the confusion and eventual anger when the truth had finally come to light, the long and careful months of rebuilding trust that had followed. "Perhaps not," she admitted, "though I like to think I would have recognized honesty eventually, whatever name it wore." He took her hand then, gently, and they continued walking together through the quiet London street, no longer strangers hiding behind false names or careful distances, but two people who had weathered scandal and deception, and emerged, against considerable odds, with something genuine and lasting between them. Years later, when Eliza's own daughter asked her, as children often do, how her parents had first fallen in love, Eliza would tell the story exactly as it had happened: the cruel words in a crowded ballroom, the slap that had echoed through London society for weeks, the secret courtship under a false name, the painful unmasking before all of London's most curious eyes, and finally, the king himself, rising from his throne to bow before a woman who had refused, at every turn, to abandon her own honesty for the comfort of easier silence. "Everyone laughed at me that night," Eliza would tell her daughter, smiling at the memory that had once caused her such pain. "They thought I had ruined myself completely. But sometimes the moments that feel most like ruin turn out to be nothing more than the beginning of something far greater than anyone, including yourself, ever expected to find." And in the quiet, contented years that followed, surrounded by a family built on honesty rather than pretense, Eliza Whitmore, now Duchess of Ashcombe, never once regretted the single moment of courage that had changed the entire course of her life.